All right, well, welcome everyone. Before we dive in, I want to take the opportunity to say how grateful we are for you, for your willingness to engage in this moment, to press in, to pray, to learn, and for your commitment to refugees and other vulnerable immigrants in this very tense time in our country. It's incredible encouragement to me, and I know to many of us at World Relief. It matters to our refugee neighbors and to the God whom we believe loves each of them. At World Relief, our mission is to boldly engage the world's greatest crises in partnership with the church here in the United States and around the world. And today, we are here to discuss the dynamics, particularly in Minnesota, but with rippling effects well beyond, of a dramatic surge of federal immigration enforcement. We've seen similar surges of immigration enforcement in cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, Charlotte over the past year. But there's a new element in what's been happening in Minnesota, in particular, with what our government is calling Operation PARRIS, or maybe Operation PARRIS. We're not quite sure how to pronounce the acronym, which is specifically targeting lawfully present refugees. So I am really honored today to be with you to help facilitate and to learn with you. My name is Matthew Sorns. I serve as the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, and we have four amazing panelists to hear from today. So I'm going to invite our panelists. We have Robin Brown, who's the Director of Immigration Programs for World Relief and is also an immigration attorney. We have Rebecca Phillips, who's the Executive Director of Programs for Arrive Ministries, which is World Relief's local affiliate in Minnesota. We have Gail Cornelius, who's the Regional Director for World Relief Wisconsin. And we have Reverend Paul Calvin, who's director of the Church of the Redeemer, which is an Anglican congregation in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'll give us a little bit of an introduction. What we want to do this morning or afternoon, depending where in the country you are, is to provide you with some perspective from the front lines in Minnesota to help you understand what has been happening from those who have been had a up close perspective on it. We want to provide some truth from God's word, allowing the scriptures to shape our response to these complex dynamics. We want to provide expertise from our team at World Relief to explain the legal and policy dynamics and then the ripple effects of these policies in states beyond Minnesota. And we want to provide you with some hope as we hear the stories of how God is at work, even in the midst of incredibly difficult circumstances, and explore ways that each of us can respond. So as we go, we're going to try to save some time for questions and answers. If you use the Q&A feature to ask questions as they occur to you, we'll be able to monitor those. Some of them we have staff on who might say, I can answer this directly via text if it's something more specific. But some of them will maybe save to ask of our panelists so that all of us can benefit from that. We will try to save that for the end after some conversations. And if we have more questions than we have time to respond to, we can also follow up with responses to some of those questions in the follow-up email that we'll send sometime after the webinar, the town hall is over. So I want to set up some context before we start our conversation as a panel. So first of all, most of us are aware that we've been in a season of a very significant immigration enforcement for much of the past year. And a lot of the rhetoric has been about going after the worst of the worst, people convicted of violent crimes. And I want to be really clear, at World Relief, we affirm the role of the government in detaining and with due process deporting immigrants who have committed violent crimes. What's concerning to us is what we've seen for months now is that our government is actually going well beyond those who are in any way a public safety threat, including a number of immigrants who were here lawfully a year ago at this time and then very abruptly had their temporary legal status revoked, or people who have a pending asylum claim. They have come into the country lawfully in many cases, have gone to the U.S. government and said, I would like to seek asylum because I have a fear of persecution for reasons like my faith or my political opinion. And U.S. law allows that process, allows those people to apply for work authorization. But people with those pending asylum claims, in many cases, have faced detention in different parts of the country. Of course, even U.S. citizens have been affected, and sometimes citizens have been asked for evidence of their citizenship. And then, of course, most tragically, at least 2 U.S. citizens have now been killed, as have several non-citizens in immigration enforcement surges in cities like Chicago. But There's also a new element that I think particularly brings us together today in Minnesota in particular that's been happening for the last 3 weeks or so. And that is this operation that the Department of Homeland Security has called Operation PARRIS. So post-admission refugee re-verification and integrity strengthening. Just as a reminder, refugees under U.S. law, for those of you who may not be familiar with the different categories of immigrants, are individuals who have fled a well-founded fear of persecution that is on account of their race, their religion, their political opinion, their national origin, or their membership in a particular social group. And the US government identifies refugees overseas, screens them overseas, verifies that they meet that legal definition in a very thorough process, also ensures that they are in no way a threat to public safety or public health. And then on an annual basis, typically a very small share of the world's refugees will be invited to rebuild their lives in the United States through the resettlement process. And World Relief and our local offices and our affiliate partners like Arrive Ministries there in Minnesota, our role really begins when those families arrive at the airport with transportation that's been facilitated by the U.S. government, and we make sure that they have housing, make sure that they find jobs, make sure the kids get into school, and make sure that they have community, make sure that there is people, usually teams from local churches or other volunteers who are coming alongside those individuals and helping them to integrate into a new community. So we've been doing that at World Relief since the 1970s. This is nothing new, but what is very new and very troubling is the effect of Operation Paris. So we first got the inklings of this back in November when USCIS, part of the Department of Homeland Security, announced that they would be re-interviewing all refugees resettled between the years of 2021 and 2025. Not to check their, if, you know, to reset, to revet the sort of security questions. That already actually happens on a regular interval. But what they were going to do is re-verify that these individuals actually had met the definition of a refugee in the first place. Basically, make them rehearse their stories and call into question whether they would keep their status as refugees, which of course led many people, hundreds of thousands of people would be affected, and many were terrified that this could mean being sent back to the countries of origins where they'd fled persecution. You know, I think from a biblical perspective, what comes to my mind is in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says that we should let our yes be your yes and our no be your no. And our government, even in a different administration, has made the determination that these individuals have met the definition of a refugee, that they lawfully belong here. They've been brought here by our government. Our government should, you know, from one administration to another, should respect those determinations. But we actually initially presumed when we got this notice in November that refugees would get letters in the mail, that they would be called to offices to go through interviews. And we were overwhelmed by what that would mean for refugees, the re-traumatization that would mean. But then what actually has happened, beginning on January 9th in Minnesota, ICE officers began showing up at the homes of refugees, in some cases sort of tricking their way in, detaining them, including children, small children in some cases, holding them for a little while in Minnesota, then sending them in most cases to Texas, where at least some of them have been re-interviewed and in some cases released, but not with transportation back to Minnesota. So people have been on their own, sometimes with their documents, sometimes without, to make their way back to Minnesota. And some people remain detained in Texas. You know, I think of this from a biblical perspective. We're told in Romans chapter 13, the Apostle Paul tells us what the role of government is. And this is a passage that comes up often when we talk about immigration issues in terms of affirming the role of government. The role of government, according to Romans 13, is to maintain order. It is to punish those who do what is wrong and to protect the rights of those who do not do what is wrong. Uh, what I think is really troubling to me in this case, and we could have lots of conversations about other immigration issues, but this is a case of people who have come lawfully, who entered the country lawfully, who are not accused of any crime, who have done everything that our government has asked of them, and yet they are living in terror. The government says that, or the Romans 13 says the government should be a terror to those who do what is wrong. But this is a case where government has gone wrong and has become a terror to those who have done what is right. And the fears are dramatic in Minnesota, of course, for those who've been detained, for those who've had a family member detained, but also for basically other refugees who are afraid to leave their homes, afraid that if they do so, they might be detained and are basically arrested. People are not going to work, which of course has financial ramifications for families. They're not going to school, which is not good for kids. They're not going to church. They're not going grocery shopping or to medical appointments. And that fear is also spreading well beyond Minnesota, because while the Department of Homeland Security has said that this process will have an initial focus on 5,600 refugees in Minnesota who have not yet received their green cards, that framing of initial implies that they intend to carry out similar actions elsewhere in the United States. and we want to be prepared. So, we're going to turn to our panelists now and talk about what is happening and learning from their expertise. So, let's start with Rebecca, who again leads Arrive Ministries programs in Minnesota. Rebecca, you're on the ground there. We've gotten to know each other quite well from a lot of phone calls over the last few weeks. Can you tell us about how this has impacted the refugees whom Arrive Ministries has resettled in the Twin Cities, and what have been their experiences?
Thank you, Matthew. It's certainly, as you've said, been a challenging and troubling time for our refugee communities here in Minnesota. That same day that we saw Operation PARRIS announced formally on January 9th, later that evening, we received the first report of a refugee individual who had been taken by ICE and detained on their way back from work, with their family being left with many questions and confusion about why that would happen and take place. Our own office had many concerns over that, and curiosities about what that would mean and what was needed. And following few days, we saw more and more refugees in our communities continue to be detained. We also saw that they were being detained initially in Minnesota, but very quickly transferred out of state to Texas detention centers. That also raised concerns for us, and many unknowns. And we began working very quickly with our greater network of resettlement providers to ensure that there are good legal supports being provided for these individuals who are being detained from the refugee communities. So we've heard reports since having some of our refugee clients who have been released after detention. We've heard firsthand from their experiences. We know that it has varied. There have been inconsistencies in some of the process that they've received. But one thing that most of them have communicated is that they are often unsure of why the detention is taking place. Some of them have been offered these re-interviewing, re-vetting interviews. Others have experienced something different than that. And so overall, I would say many are confused and afraid. Many who have been released fear being re-detained. And we still have questions around that at this time. And so I would say in general, the impact on refugees in Minnesota has been great and concerning.
Well, I'm so thankful for your faithful presence there, Rebecca, in the midst of a remarkably difficult situation. We'll keep hearing from you, but I want to turn to you, Robin. So, Robin, you lead our national immigration programs. You're also an immigration attorney. When this first started happening, my first question, I'm not an attorney, but I have a little bit of background with immigration legal issues, and I've always understood that refugees were lawfully present, unambiguously. Is that correct? And if so, how is what's been happening possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, when we use the term refugees, we are talking about those who are thoroughly vetted, that have met the legal definition of refugee, they've been lawfully admitted. When they come in refugee status, that is an indefinite status, meaning that it does not expire. So someone remains a refugee from the time they are admitted until they become a green card holder if they do apply for a green card. Not applying for a green card is not a reason that they can be deported. It is not a ground of removal that they can be put into removal proceedings for. So it is a surprise to us as well that this sort of activity is happening, that individuals are being detained seemingly on the basis that they simply just don't have a green card yet. Sometimes they don't have a green card yet because they have filed, but it hasn't been processed yet by the US government. It often takes more than a year for the US government to process those applications. And currently, all the applications by refugees for green cards are paused right now. So it is not necessarily their fault that they do not have that green card. And we believe that the reason that Homeland Security is basically asserting for why they can detain these individuals, which we would disagree with, is that there is a provision in the Immigration and Nationality Act that does discuss someone who has been here in refugee status for a year and does not have a green card shall return or be returned to the custody of the Department of Homeland Security for examination and inspection. Now, that term custody and examination, inspection, never before has that been interpreted or implemented to mean actual physical arrest and detention of these individuals. So that is a new way of reading that statute and certainly what is being argued about in court. But there are other ways this can be done, such as individuals applying for a green card and going through an interview in a non-detained setting if necessary.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Robin. Father Paul, your church is one of many in Minnesota that has partnered with Arrive Ministries to welcome refugees. So first off, why does your church care about refugees? And then how has Operation Paris impacted those whom your church is most connected to?
Thanks, Matt. I mean, I think, first of all, it's just there's a biblical mandate to show hospitality to strangers and sojourners. In the Old Testament, God's people are exhorted to say, I am the Lord your God. Remember that I brought you out of bondage. I brought you out of a place of sojourning into a land of your own. And so from Leviticus, just a command to treat the stranger and the sojourner as a native among you, to love him as yourself. For we, God's people initially were strangers in the land, but then it's just saying, I am the Lord, like honor me, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. I think second, if we are people, especially as evangelicals, who believe that the gospel is all for all nations, and as a priest in a liturgical setting, we're celebrating Epiphany, which is remembers how Jesus came to all nations, came to the Gentiles. If we feel a call to global missions, then certainly we should feel as well a call to reach out and to love foreign-born neighbors as ourselves, and to show the love of Christ to them. And then in Scripture it says, begin in showing love to the household of faith. And the reality is that many refugees are Christians. And so it's important for us to show care, first of all, to those who are fellow believers. How could we have conviction and a credible word to the world if we don't care for those who have been united to Christ and we united to them? So Operation Paris it's provoked a lot of worry and insecurity. Many of the people we've worked with over years past, but then this Korean congregation I mentioned in the op-ed piece are staying at home. There's a scramble to try to do what they can do to get their green card applications done, to find legal aid, and just insecurity about what is safe and prudent in society.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Paul. We're going to talk a little bit more about your op-ed in a moment. I want to turn to you, Gail. So you are in Wisconsin, which people remember their geography is right across the river from Minnesota. And in fact, Eau Claire, Wisconsin, where we have one of our Wisconsin World Relief offices, is less than an hour away from the state line. We're all very concerned about what's happening in Minnesota, but I also think it's important to know that this is having ripple effects well beyond Minnesota. So can you tell us how refugees there in Eau Claire and elsewhere in Wisconsin are feeling as they process the news coming out of Minnesota?
Absolutely. So in some ways, Minnesota feels far away, but for most of us, especially refugees in our community, it feels like our backyard right now. And so a lot of the same sorts of fears and reactions that Rebecca has expressed from refugee families in Minnesota, that's what we're experiencing in Wisconsin too. For families that we work with that have fled persecution and already gone through the extensive vetting that you discussed, this feels like yet another unexpected barrier, something that they weren't prepared for, and can be really traumatizing for folks that feel like they have come here to seek this safety, to seek stability, and now we're uprooting all of that stability for them. So it's also some refugees still feel like this won't impact them because they have done everything the right way, right? They have followed all of the process. They have completed all of the paperwork like they're supposed to. And so for us in an organization, I think that's a really difficult place to be too, where we say, yes, you have done everything correctly, but you actually are still at risk now. And for folks that have lived a life of risk in many cases, this is just another re-traumatizing effect now. So like Rebecca mentioned, same sorts of things where we are seeing families where maybe the parents aren't going to work, children are staying home. adjusting their schedules, trying to travel with maybe U.S. citizen friends or good neighbor teams in the community. And so folks are really, their lives are being uprooted once again, and that's really difficult to see.
I appreciate you sharing that. It's hard to hear, but I think important for us to understand how broad the effects of this are. Rebecca, I want to go back to you to get a little bit more of a sense of what's happening there in the Twin Cities, and both what's happening to refugees when they are brought to Texas. What's been your understanding of what has happened for those refugees? And then what is the effect on the refugees who've not been detained? Are there or maybe you're having people show up, the ICE show up at their homes, or because just tell us a little bit more of what's happening on the ground there.
Yeah. Well, at this point, we estimate that it's over 100 refugees in Minnesota who have been detained, and most of which have been transferred immediately to Texas. Some have remained in Minneapolis detentions and therefore been released from this location, but most have been sent to Texas and ultimately released there or still detained today. And so that's a large portion of our refugee community already. And again, we have growing concerns that will continue. For those who have been detained and gone through that experience, it has certainly been re-traumatizing for most of them. Many of them, again, experiencing some harsh conditions throughout their detention period, and certainly questions and confusion every step of the way. Similar to what others have said, our refugee clients and neighbors, they know that they are here lawfully in the US, and so they're quite confused about how they are a part of what is going on with ICE enforcement. And I think many of them are looking for ways to be able to communicate their own status to others to help them understand that that they've come here lawfully and that they shouldn't be subjected to that type of behavior or those type of tactics and experiences. And so, our office is doing our best to try and provide wraparound supports to those who are being released, to assist with connecting with mental health resources and other stabilizing resources once they're back at home, back in their communities here in Minnesota, as they've been through a lot. And I think as it relates to the impact on just the greater refugee community, we have thousands of refugees, 5,600 as listed in this operation that could be impacted. And they're feeling these impacts as well. As others have said, they're feeling too afraid to leave their homes, unsafe to go to work, to send their kids to school, unsafe to go to critical medical appointments, some of which they're choosing to go to, even knowing the risks because of how important they are. But it has really greatly impacted their day-to-day lives and livelihood. I would say that similarly, our volunteers and our community members have been amazing to step up and accompany them if they do have to go to those critical appointments so that they're not alone. That's been our primary message to get to them, is that they are not alone, and we have a community that wants to support them in this process. And many are afraid, though. Many are afraid and confused and have a lot of questions, just as I know we all do as well about this operation.
Yeah. And that's a good reminder, Rebecca. For those who have questions, we're already seeing some questions come in, but please use the Q&A feature and we will respond to as many of those as we have time for. And then if we need to, we'll send answers via email afterward as well. Paul, you had, as you already mentioned this, but you had an op-ed that was published in the USA Today earlier this week, really powerful piece that drew attention to the reality that one of the top countries of origin for refugees resettled to Minnesota, and actually nationally as well, has been Myanmar, also known as Burma, which is a place where Christians and other religious minorities have faced very harsh persecution in significant part because of their faith. Can you tell us a little bit more about the specific population of the Karen refugees that you know and how they have been affected by what's going on with Operation PARRIS?
Yeah. So just a visual example. So this is a Karen shirt that was given to me last year. I had friends that gave one. It wasn't just for me, but for my whole family. We all got like a bag with Karen shirt. And when it was given to me, I looked at both sides and I was like, what's the front? What's the back? And they said, well, that's important. We are the same coming towards you and we're the same going away from you. Like integrity is like essential to their people, at least, and certainly the Karen people that I know. They come from Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. They began arriving in Minnesota in the early 2000s. And again, many of Karen are Christians who fled civil war with the Myanmar military, which is dominated by a Burmese majority that's very Buddhist. And so there's a religious aspect as well to their status and their persecution. There's now about 20,000 Karen who live in Minnesota. Most of them live in the St. Paul area, so not far from our church where I'm sitting right now, but some in small cities and towns in outstate Minnesota. And again, as Rebecca said, many they've been integrated, going to schools, working, involved in the community, and so it's a very abrupt sense of is it prudent for me to go out to go to church? It's affected their church attendance from friends that I know, and it's just had a very significant impact on the security of their community. And they're not just thinking about individuals, but like how can we care about all of our church body, all of our family networks.
That's, I lived in an apartment complex in Chicagoland for many years where most of my neighbors, or many of my neighbors, were Karen. And I remember at least a few of them coming to my door at one point with to sing some Christian music and to make sure that I know who Jesus was. And I've always been challenged by that I've been a Christian most of my life. I'm really grateful for that. But I've had a lot to learn about following Jesus from these brothers and sisters who were persecuted in their country of origin, spent years in a refugee camp, and then have done the hard work of rebuilding in the United States. And then to see them go through this again, it's frustrating and heartbreaking. I want to pivot kind of back to a legal question, Robin. You alluded to this already, but one of the things we've heard from the administration is that they're focusing on refugees who are not yet lawful permanent residents. They don't yet have their green cards. And I get that to most people, that probably sounds like these are people who are not legally present because they don't have their lawful permanent resident status. But that's actually not the case, as we've already talked about. Can you just review a little bit what the process is for refugees to obtain their green cards and help us understand why some of them are delayed in processing? Just how do those dynamics work?
Yeah. So to file for a green card, an individual needs to fill out a form called the I-485 application to adjust status. That is a complex form. It's a 24-page form at this point, lots of nuanced questions that would require some understanding of US legal policies, as well as a good understanding of the English language or an interpreter. So that process in itself, just filling out the form, can be a daunting one for which many refugees do need legal assistance. And that can be difficult to even obtain that legal assistance. Many organizations, nonprofits that offer legal services, they have long wait lists, sometimes hundreds of individuals in the same position that need help with the same form. And there's not capacity to help them all immediately. So they may face challenges in even getting that part of the process done. And then once they do file, there's additional challenges. As mentioned earlier, US Citizenship and Immigration Services has varied processing times, but they are lengthy processing times, and they're also very hard to predict when they will speed up or slow down, but it's usually slow down. In addition to that, as mentioned, there is currently a pause on processing all refugee green card applications. So someone may have done every single thing in a timely manner and still be at risk currently of being detained through really no fault of their own, no wrong action of their own. But generally, while someone has applied for a green card, they can, as a refugee, continue to live and work in the United States during that time.
Yeah. I read a legal filing yesterday of a woman from Myanmar who had actually filed her green card application exactly 1 year to the date to her arrival. I mean, as close to the letter of the law as possible, and nevertheless was detained from her home while breastfeeding a 5-month-old child who was left behind. And these are the sort of stories that we're hearing. Gail, I think we all hope and pray that that dynamic of detaining lawfully present refugees and transporting them to other states doesn't become the norm across the country, though that is a serious concern. But even if the Department of Homeland Security would just send letters summoning refugees to interviews to have their refugee status reassessed, which is sort of what we'd presumed would happen when we first learned about this back in November, to do that for, they've said they would do that for all 230,000 refugees resettled by the previous administration, including those in Wisconsin. And I can imagine that would be profoundly upsetting to a lot of refugees, even if it didn't involve being detained from their homes. Can you explain to us why?
Becoming a refugee is not something that folks do by choice, right? They are fleeing persecution or threats of persecution. And so the process itself is already extensively long. They are going through so many barriers. And getting off that plane and arriving in the US, or in our case in Wisconsin, is sometimes their first step to really feel like they're going to be able to rebuild their lives now that they can become flourishing members of our communities. And so anything that really throws a wrench in that is incredibly upsetting. And again, we keep going back to this word re-traumatizing, but that really is what it is, where folks feel like they're seeking this sense of safety, of stability, something they waited for a very long time. And now we're changing all of that and saying you're actually not necessarily stable here. Again, even if you have done everything the right way. Something Rebecca mentioned, which I just wanted to echo, is that we are also hearing refugees, because they know that they have done all of the processes the right way, ask how they can prove that, right? How can they sign up for going through this process of re-interview so they're not taken by ICE or have to go through those encounters? And so it's really, refugees want to assert their rights. They want to show that they belong. And so being able to really find avenues to do that is incredibly difficult at this time. Also, would just love to highlight an op-ed from one of our colleagues, Isam, who is a trauma counselor and mental health manager for World Relief, who wrote a bit about what this experience can be like and some of the fears that are expressed within our refugee communities that we work with. So I think we'll drop that in the chat too.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. I think that was a really powerful piece, and Dr. Isam is a brilliant guy and a good friend of mine, and I've learned so much from him because of the dynamics of trauma and how it works, and also the resilience that's possible, the way that God made human beings, and we see that, and yet to bring people back there is so heartbreaking. But I don't want to stop on heartbreaking. Let's move to some hope. I'm actually going to put the questions a little bit out of order. Robin, I'm going to go to you first because there have been developments that are hopeful to me, even just in the last 24 hours, even less than that. A few days ago, we learned that there had been a lawsuit filed by several of the refugees who have been affected by Operation PARRIS in Minnesota, a lawsuit against Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, and then some other administration officials seeking to halt the process. So tell us, Robin, what is the status of that legal action?
Yeah, yes, this is a hopeful development for sure. So just so grateful to be able to share about this. The short name of the case is UHA v. Bondi, and it was filed on January 24th. So this has been moving really quickly through the court, for which we are grateful as well. So the plaintiffs in this case are some individuals that are refugees that have been affected by these detention policies, as well as an organizational plaintiff that has had its operations affected by all of this. They are seeking an immediate stop to the arrest and detention of what we call unadjusted refugees, those that don't yet have a green card, who haven't been charged with any sort of crime, no sort of removability grounds. And they're also seeking release from detention for anyone in that situation that is originally living in Minnesota. So this only is really within the scope of Minnesota. They're also seeking the return to Minnesota of anyone who has been transported out of state and detained. So what happened yesterday is that temporary restraining order, or TRO, was issued in that case. So that has ordered the stop to these arrests, these detentions, these transporting of individuals out of state, and ensuring that those who have been transported out of state are returned. So that's very good news. However, it is, again, just limited right now to Minnesota. It's also temporary by definition. There will be further developments in the case. There's another hearing in February and ongoing consideration of the merits of the case as well. And it does not apply anywhere outside of Minnesota. It's also possible that this could get appealed by Department of Homeland Security And so we'll see. We'll see if it sticks, but it is a good sign. And Judge Tunheim has written a strong opinion that analyzes and explains where this is found to be an unlawful action by unlawful actions, I should say, by Homeland Security. And so hopefully that will get upheld as the case continues.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. It was I was about to leave my office last night when that news came through, and it was really encouraging with the caveats that you shared. That's just an initial ruling, and it could change, and of course, the appeals process. And it's really only applies to Minnesota, which doesn't in itself restrict the possibility of this moving elsewhere, which has been one of the concerns. But it's a hopeful development, and we'll hold on to hope where we can. The other place I know that I have found a lot of hope is actually in the response from people in Minnesota and beyond, and especially in the church, in our various church partners. Rebecca, Arrive's mission and purpose as ministry is, very similar to World Relief, has the church and the call to welcome refugees and immigrants very central. Where have you seen the church stand up in the past 3 weeks there in Minnesota?
Yeah, our church partners and the broader Minnesota community have been absolutely critical in supporting our refugee neighbors during this time and extremely responsive in offering their supports, both practically through prayer, through advocacy, through standing with them throughout this process. And so we have seen so many local churches on their own and in partnership with us start up grocery deliveries for families who are staying safe at home, who aren't able to leave safely to go grocery shopping and get food for their families. They've delivered critical hygiene items that are needed as families are staying at home, they need those things as well. They've also, through volunteer opportunities, continued to respond to the emerging needs around connecting those to further supports and helping them get access distant learning set up for their children who aren't able to go to school. We have many local schools who are offering virtual options in this season, and that takes a process to get set up with. We've also had church partners and volunteers accompanying clients to those critical medical appointments or others that can't be rescheduled so that they have a safe person with them. Really greatly increases the support they feel as they leave their home if they know they can do that alongside of someone else and have that physical presence. Again, they've helped to prepare family preparedness plans. So for those refugee families to know what to do if someone in their family is detained and have the resources, and continuing to remind them of how they can know and exercise their rights as well that they have. Helping advocate for them if they are detained. We've had volunteers who have gone over and above to support them in the detention process and in the release process as well. And then ultimately being a friend, being a presence. We remind our staff and our volunteers and all of our church partners that the most important message for refugees right now is that they're not alone. And the church has just been pivotal in stepping into that and stepping into the lives of our refugee neighbors to ensure they know that.
Yeah, it's been a very dark few weeks, but also these moments of light kind of piercing through. And Jesus tells his disciples there to be the light of the world, and it's beautiful to get to see that. And Minnesota has been shining very brightly. Paul, I'm going to give you the same question to you. I know that your congregation is connected to several other congregations throughout the Twin Cities that have been working really tirelessly to provide support. Can you tell me what you've seen?
Yeah. Well, I would just say first off, the Karen congregation that I'm most familiar with, I just want to give an example of like how ordained and lay leaders in their community have cared for their community members. They pray online 4 to 5 times a week, and that has impact for people in St. Paul, but also in outstate Minnesota, other Karen communities nationally, and then even internationally. I mean, if you look at these Zoom calls, there's people in bamboo structures in Thailand that they're still communicating and praying and interceding like to the God who is everywhere, Lord of all. And they are working within their community to make sure everyone is cared for with food, with legal aid and other things. Just another example of hope. So this priest that I mentioned in the op-ed piece, who's become a friend, I was exhorting him to be prudent. Don't go out unnecessarily. And he just said, I'm not going to be afraid, that God cares for us. And then this was the real kicker, like just to say that if we are detained, like God can use us in detention. as well, right? Like it's not to be irresponsible, but that Jesus is still Lord, even in those harshest of circumstances, which they've known through a lifetime, and even having faith and hope and love in the midst of this difficult time. So I just want to commend the Karen congregation, and I'm sure many immigrant communities in Minnesota as well. But it's also a blessing to see the household of faith acting as salt and light in our cities, and how relationships over many years, not related to crisis, are now bearing fruit in order to bring resources to people who are in need. That people with some degree of trust are able to reach out and have connections. So if somebody isn't able to go out and get groceries, there's someone who is trustworthy who can bring them. And people who are acting as hubs of communication and bridges between communities, which Arrive Ministries, just many years of good neighbor teams in different circumstances, has been really an important part of setting a foundation for these relationships that are now bearing fruit in the midst of this particular crisis. There's one church in Minneapolis. It has sort of a pod structure in which there's one pod with kind of a pod leader and then multiple supporting members who are then connected with a migrant, and then will provide whatever needs that person maybe has, like groceries, hygiene items, and diapers. After a month in which many people have been out of work, there's even moves afoot to provide rent relief for some of these people. And so it's really exciting to see that. And that's just one of many different networks in the cities and in the state that are responding. And then in just a final point of hope, that this is an opportunity to share the good news of God in Christ, that people in our community are seeking, like, where are the people of peace? Where are people who care about justice? And we have these examples of churches, we have these examples of immigrant groups who are still exercising faith, hope, and love in the midst of trial. And on one of sort of a local community feed, this church that I mentioned with the pod structure, somebody wrote, shout out to this congregation for practicing what they preach. It is important for the church to have that integrity, that we are, again, the same kind of coming and going and representing Christ in us.
Yeah, it is such an important time for the church to live out the things that we say we believe. And it doesn't always make it into the media. In fact, it's hard to get into the media without imperiling, the safety of some of the people we're trying to serve. And I help coordinate public relations for World Relief, so I know that very well. But I do want people to know that the church is in the Twin Cities and really across Minnesota, rural Minnesota even as well, are stepping up in some beautiful ways. And at World Relief, we want to come behind that in whatever way that we can. Of course, we have a lot of people listening from Minnesota, I imagine, but also a lot of people from beyond Minnesota who are wondering, like, well, what can my church do? What could I do maybe as an individual if I'm not in Minnesota? So, Gail, I'd love for you to speak to that from Wisconsin, but of course for people from other states as well.
Absolutely. So, while we're certainly all prayerful and hopeful that these impacts won't be felt broadly across the country, I think it's prudent to start planning for that now. So, if you have community organizations, or as a church, you're wondering now on this call, well, we don't have refugees being detained yet in my community, so what should I do now? Say now is the time to act, and there's several ways that you can do that. First, through advocacy, right? And we'll talk a bit more about tangible ways that you can reach out to your elected officials, that you can advocate for the rights of refugees in our community. And the other piece that's really important now, I would say, is helping to support families to prepare for this type of action in our communities. So working through some of those family emergency plans and helping to prepare refugees for what might come next, and make sure that they have, their ducks in a row, that they have things in order for if they are impacted, and then be ready to mobilize if in fact we do have these operations directly in our communities.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, Gail. Nobody wants to raise a false alarm and scare people, but it is prudent to be prepared and to do what we can do now to prepare. I know I was talking to Rebecca yesterday, and she said this started in Minnesota. We hope it ends in Minnesota, but we can't be fully confident of that either, and it's why it's to be prepared. We're going to go to some questions now, and I will tell you, we have literally hundreds of questions. I think more than we anticipated, which is wonderful. We're probably not going to be able to respond to them all. I know we have some World Relief colleagues who are answering some of the specific questions in the chat where we can. But so I will also say, if we do not get to your question, which is fairly likely with several hundred questions, we are going to try to respond at least to, I think some of them are very similar via email with sort of an FAQ with frequently asked questions. But let me start. Let's see, so many we could go to here. Um, I might ask this, and probably Robin or Rebecca, either of you might have an answer to this. But what is happening to children born in the United States with immigrant parents who are being detained or deported? If they're born in the United States, they're U.S. citizens. At least this law is understood right now. So you have a sense of that, and of course that could mean for refugees. It could be others who who have parents who've been detained as well.
Rebecca, I don't know if you want to speak to what you have seen so far there in Minnesota. I think we are still seeing how this unfolds in many situations. DHS should be seeking another individual to care for those children rather than placing them into detention. But sometimes the choice is not actually given to the immigrant. And so they should have a voice in that, but I don't think that that's necessarily being complied with in all situations.
Yeah, and I would just add, we have not had any specific situations, thankfully, that have fit that category yet. But we do have plenty of refugee families and clientele that have US born babies or infants. And so that's certainly a concern of the possibility. And I would say how we're approaching that is really focusing in on these family preparedness plans. So sitting with families, working with families to make sure they have the documents filled out they need for someone else, another guardian to take on their children if those worst case scenarios were to take place, so that they can feel prepared and know that their children would be taken care of if the unexpected did happen.
Yeah, I know that's something that World Relief offices are doing across the country and with refugees, with other immigrants, just to be prepared. Um, Rebecca, another question we've had several along this lines is, what's happening in Texas when families are released? We know that not every family has been released yet, although the effect of this temporary restraining order is that they should be soon. But when the families have been released, what happens then? And are there ways to be involved if we have, folks who are in Texas?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, we've gotten a lot of those questions from our local community as well, which we're really grateful for the offering of support there. So what we have typically seen is that refugees who are transferred to Texas typically are starting their process in detention centers in Houston. But from there, they've been transferred to other facilities throughout Texas as well. So there is no one way that we've seen everything take place there. But we do know that when they are ultimately released from a detention center somewhere in Texas, they are often released without any assistance from ICE or DHS in getting home. And so, again, in those initial families that happened to, or individuals, we were just so grateful to see their own family members, community members, churches or volunteers step in to help them get back home. Since we've learned more in these last couple of weeks, we've been able to partner with local organizations and churches in the Houston area and throughout Texas who have come out and said they want to support picking up those who are released suddenly to make sure they have somewhere temporary to stay, that they can be a touch point for us on the ground in Texas so that we can coordinate together to get those families safely back to Minnesota. So we've been really grateful to partner with those local Texas organizations and get that started so that we have phone numbers for people to call and connections to make.
It's been really beautiful to see the body of Christ that spans state lines pulling together, and people who beyond our faith as well, who are willing to step in and care for people. And it's lots of beauty in the midst of some really hard dynamics. Probably only have time for one more question. This is maybe for you, Robin. We had several questions about this very high-profile situation where there was a 5-year-old boy who was detained by ICE. I believe his name is Liam Conejo Ramos. And from my understanding, he was not a refugee, but he was an asylum seeker. So can you explain a little bit what the difference is in those terms? And even what's happening to people with pending asylum claims now? And does this legal action have any effect on them? Yeah.
Yeah, these are great questions. I think it's a common point of confusion between what is a refugee and who is an asylum seeker. So individuals applying for asylum do that. They either request asylum at the US border, which right now really isn't an option, or once they enter the United States. So whether they came through lawful pathways, such as a student visa, and maybe remained here after that visa ended or are still in lawful status, or if they came unlawfully. Either way, under our law and under international obligations, we are able and should be adjudicating the requests for asylum. They still need to meet the legal definition of refugee, but they're applying here within the United States, and they have the right to do that. There are two ways to do that. One is filing to US Citizenship and Immigration Services. They have paused the processing of all asylum applications at this time. So that means they are not issuing any final decisions on any of the pending cases, which is hundreds of thousands of individuals waiting for a decision. And then another way is if they are already in immigration court, they can apply before the immigration judge. Those cases are still moving, but it's a big backlog. Yeah, again, hundreds of thousands of cases. And so there's many, many individuals who are in limbo that are following the correct process to apply for asylum. But unfortunately, they're not getting very many answers at this time, which leaves them in limbo and does leave them, many of them prone to being detained. So that having a pending asylum application is not in itself a protection from being detained. And yeah, many individuals are certainly living in fear of that or experiencing detention themselves right now. And the court cases that are going on right now regarding refugees, they do not have any effect at all on those who are asylum seekers. It only affects those who entered lawfully as refugees.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that there's still a lot of people, even if this court ruling holds, which I think most of us hope it does, who are very vulnerable right now, including people who are in a legal process, who are authorized to work, who, are going through a lot process outlined in our laws. And that's a very troubling dynamic, and one we've already seen well beyond Minnesota as well, really across the country. I wish we had more time for questions. I will answer one question myself, and then I'll move on to just close this out. But there was a question here of like, where can we find good information? Of course, we want to provide good information to your World Relief. We're doing our best, and we will be following up with answers to some of the other questions, which were some great questions here. There was a question on how do we, when we're told that most of the people who are being detained by ICE are actually not people who've been convicted of violent crimes. Like, what's the source for that? So I'll actually put in the chat a resource from the Cato Institute on that question. Um, as of November, and we get data from the federal government with a little bit of a delay, but it was 5% of immigrants who were being held in detention facilities who've been convicted of a violent crime. And again, at World Relief, we think in most cases that's appropriate. Someone who's committed a violent crime and been convicted and had due process, and it's appropriate to detain those individuals. That's a different category than refugees who haven't committed any crime, and asylum seekers who haven't committed any crime. From people who may have had an immigration violation many years ago, but for whom we've always believed at World Relief there ought to be better solutions than splitting up families. And that kind of brings us to, well, what can we do? And I'll get to advocacy in a moment, but I think before we talk about advocacy, it's so important to ground ourselves in prayer. I want to share that as sort of the first way to invite you to engage. There's been a lot of moments in the last 3 weeks where I have just not known what to do because the laws weren't working the way that I thought laws were supposed to work, and the government wasn't behaving the way that I think government is supposed to behave. Psalm 34 says, "In my desperation, I prayed, and the Lord listened." And I have really been challenged personally to go back to Jesus, to bring before him the hardships that many of the people that I care about and that many of you care about are facing, and to intercede. Some of you may even feel like God is calling you to fast, to spend some intentional time pleading to God for our country, and especially for those who are vulnerable, for refugees, for asylum seekers, for other categories of immigrants who are vulnerable in the midst of this surge of immigration detention. The second thing that I would invite you to do is to advocate. We put together at World Relief a sign-on statement to the president, to the members of the administration, to members of Congress, uh, asking our government to stop this process that they've proposed to revet all refugees, and certainly then to stop detaining people to bring that process about. As of this week, we've had more than 10,000 people sign that statement, which is amazing. Some of you, probably many of you, have already signed that statement. If you can't remember if you signed the statement, go ahead and sign it again. We'll screen that out. We actually have like 12,000 signatures from 10,000 people because probably a few people forgot if they'd signed this already. That's okay. But I would actually, if you have already signed it, invite you to also think about some other people whom you know who are followers of Jesus, who, if they understood what was happening, and you could share the recording of this webinar that we will share with you, would want to advocate as well. So, maybe it's some members of your family, maybe it's people in your small group at church, but we would really encourage you to consider that. We would love to have this be 20,000. We've actually already sent this to the Hill, to Capitol Hill. We did so yesterday. We sent it to the administration, to Tom Homan's office, who's the borders are, who apparently is sort of in charge in Minnesota now. We want to appeal to him to stop this policy, obviously, and also to comply with this legal order. But if we need to, we'll come back next week, and I would love to come back with 20,000 signatures from Christians around the country. And then you could even take it a step beyond that. On our website, after you sign the statement, it'll invite you to make a phone call to your members of Congress and convey that you're not pleased with what's happening. So the advocacy, it really does make a difference. I think we're seeing some of the difference it's making as in the last few days. And then the third way I would invite you to engage is by donating, by giving. For us at World Relief, if these policies would continue to expand to other parts of the country, and again, we take the government at their word when they say this is an initial focus on 5,600 refugees in Minnesota who denied of their green cards. If that does expand nationally, for World Relief alone, not including those resettled by other resettlement agencies, but just by those resettled through the World Relief Network, we estimate that that's about 17,600 refugees, about 4,400 families that we have cared for at World Relief and who could be at risk of being unjustly detained, deported, potentially separated from family. And again, even if it's just a letter in the mail, which would be a more humane process, it still is going to be very, very frightening for these families. And we want as many of them as possible to have legal representation. If it is in a situation where people are detained, where they could have assistance with rent, with food, basic needs if they're not able to go to work. We've been trusting God to provide $500,000 across the country for this need, and He is moving. As of this morning, I'm told that we're already about halfway to that goal, and it has been beautiful. And a lot of that has come to specific local World Relief offices, and then some at the national level, which we're able to share some of that with our partners in Minnesota, including Arrive Ministries. So we would invite you to give or to think of, pray about how you might do that. And the last thing I would say, for those of you who are church leaders or pastors, we've developed a free church crisis response toolkit that we have created just for you, that we want to help you discern how to lead in your congregation and to really help ask how your congregation might respond to this crisis with discernment questions, talking points, communications templates, prayer and action slides. We want to equip you in any way that we can. We believe so strongly at World Relief that this is a moment for the church, that our mission is to engage the world's greatest crises in partnership with the church, and we desperately need the church to respond to what's happening right now. We are seeing that. We are so grateful to see it, and we need to see it happen even more. So I want to close us with prayer, and first I want to thank each one of you who's participated. More than 1,500, like 1,500 people have been on live, and we know more will watch this recording. I also want to thank Robin and Gail and Rebecca and Paul, not only for giving your time today, but for the work that you're doing day in and day out to respond to this. Let me close us in prayer. Father God, you know what it's like to be a refugee, Jesus. You fled persecution as a small child fleeing a tyrannical government of King Herod. You know what it's like to grow up in a place that's different and to adjust to life in different places. And ultimately, Lord, you left the glories of heaven in a celestial migration to take on human flesh and walk among us. And then you invite your church to welcome strangers, to feed the hungry, to give to those who are in need of water, to provide shelter and clothing, and to do so because when we do so as unto you. Lord, we pray for your church that that would be our response. We thank you for the ways we are already seeing you show up. And we especially pray for our lawmakers, for the president, for leaders with the authority to change this situation. And we also pray, most of all, for those who are directly affected by this. We pray for your presence with them and that you be revealing yourself to them, even in the midst of this really difficult situation. We pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you all.